This is the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Hello. This is Robert Kiyosaki. The good news and bad news about money. And today it's about education. So today we're talking about a very important subject called education. And, to many people, I don't know what happened to them, but they have this religion called you got to go to school so you can get a job. And I think that's the problem. It's become a religion and not a spiritual thing anymore. But my first book, which I don't recommend anybody read, it was called If You Want to Be Rich and Happy, Don't Go to School. Because the proof of the pudding is right now, suicide rate among young people is up. And kids have no money. And parents have no money because the bloody school system sucks the cash out of them. And that's why I wrote, if you want to be rich and happy, don't go to school. Please don't read the book because I got more hate mail for that book than any other book, more than Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So all you parents out there who have this mantra, go to school to get a job, you got to go to school and get a job. Well, you got to go to Harvard, you got to go to Stanford. The proof is in the pudding right now that school is actually, or maybe, I won't go into because it's politically incorrect, maybe school is damaging your kids. What if school was actually damaging your kids? Would you really keep them in school? Or are you one of those damaged kids right now? Are you there on suicide watch? Wondering what happened? Why am I working at a job I hate? Why am I not making any money? Why is the cash being sucked out of my pocket? And I have no future. AI, I'm probably going to be an Uber driver, but Uber drivers will be out of work pretty soon. What the heck happened to my life? Maybe the problem started because he went to school. So today we have a very interesting guest, and he has a fascinating book. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. And joining me in studio today is Bob Turner. He has kids, my wife Kim and I. We don't have kids. I don't know if that was smart or stupid, but most of our friends say it was the smartest thing we ever did, those who have kids. And I tell you, I feel for parents because, man, that is a 24/7 job that I really didn't want to undertake. So with that, given that I have a bias against kids, we have Bob Turner filling in for Kim here. So our guest today is Greg Lukianoff. Is that pronounced Lukianoff?
It's Lukianoff.
Lukianoff, thank you very much. And you are a First Amendment attorney. You're a New York Times bestseller and president and CEO of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. See, you're one of those radicals, aren't you?
I've been, if you count free speech as a radical idea, and I think it's always a radical idea.
It is getting more radical.
Wants to censor you.
It is getting more radical, isn't it?
In a sense, it is getting easier to say the wrong thing. And I wrote a book called Freedom from Speech back in 2014, talking about how increasingly in American society we seem to be walking on eggshells, partially out of fear of losing our jobs if we say the wrong thing on social media or Facebook.
Try me, lawsuits.
Yeah.
When you have money and you say something stupid, you get sued.
Yeah.
And it's not even stupid. I have no free speech anymore. So,
yeah, well, lawyers kind of ruin everything, and I say that as a lawyer myself.
So, Bob Turner, how long have you been with the Rich Dad Company?
I've been with the Rich Dad Company 16 years now, and the transformation as far as what I've learned, alternate points of view from Robert and such, has really, allowed me to talk to my kids about certain issues that most parents don't.
And what are your concerns? How old are your kids?
My daughter Sarah is 18, and my son Jacob is 16.
And did they get one still in school then?
Correct.
And your daughter, who's 18, did she just get out of school?
Just got out of school in this past May.
And what's her plans now?
Well, she wants to go into a nursing program.
That's good.
Just for the idea that it's such a shortage of nurses.
Profession, yeah.
Correct. My son is still undecided. He doesn't know where he wants to go, and he said such exposure to. Rich Dad message that he doesn't want to he doesn't want to go to college at the moment.
So, again, this is Greg Lukianoff, and his book is The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. And I'm glad you're here. Like I said, my first book, you want to be rich and happy, don't go to school. I took the heat for that one. I don't want to take any more heat, so I'm glad you're taking the heat now, Greg. So tell me, why did you write such a controversial book?
Well, I've been working on campuses defending freedom of speech since 2001. And
you must be a masochist. You must be a masochist.
Well, you have to develop a thick skin and a sense of humor, and in my case, learn cognitive behavioral therapy to sort of talk yourself down from the ledge from time to time.
What is cognitive behavioral? What is that? Because you're talking to a former Marine. I don't know that stuff.
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy actually goes pretty well with being a Marine, and you actually probably did some of this to yourself without knowing it. It's more or less it's therapy, but only kind of a name only. It really is a way of talking back to your more sort of exaggerated thoughts in your head. That if something goes wrong, that you're gonna, this is gonna be the death of you. That if a date doesn't go well, you're gonna die alone. All of these kind of things that anxious and depressed people do can actually be defeated more or less by getting a habit of actually seeing those exaggerated things you say in your head. And the premise in the book is that higher education, far from teaching people to kind of calm down and sort of talk themselves down from things that cause anxiety and depression, we unfortunately think a lot of higher education is actually talking people into it.
But so let me ask you this. So what happens, isn't suicide rate up?
Suicide rate is up, and here's one of the things. That's up, particularly, it's up 25% for young men, which is horrifying. That's very high, and that's comparing the last 2 years to the previous, to the first decade of the 21st century. But for girls and young women, it's up 70%.
Holy mackerel!
It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible, and what's concerning here is that's across the board. That's not just people who go to higher education.
So what did you find out? Why are they off at the prime of life? Life's just getting started.
The strongest indication is that social media has a lot to do with it.
Well, that's not social media; it's anti-social media. That's what I call
right.
it.
Yeah.
I don't know how anybody survives on that thing.
And we talk about it, in the book. That we devote a chapter to it. We talk about social media a lot in the book. And when people are kind of skeptical of well, how could social media be making it this much worse for girls? And the thought experiment I have them do is go, imagine the absolute worst, nasty environment of junior high school that you can remember, and imagine that 24 hours a day for the rest of your life.
So the dark side of kids comes out in anti-social media because they're faceless, right? They can just make any comment they want, and you can't no retaliation, no face to face.
And it hits girls harder, partially because a lot of the way that girls show aggression is through everything from gossip to sort of relational approaches, which unfortunately social media makes incredibly easy. Boys are somewhat less affected by it because the main way boys interact with aggression is physically, and when it comes to blowing off steam, we tend to play video games rather than go on Instagram.
So, Bob, what are your concerns for your boy? Let's say right now.
Well, relating to social media, we try to limit that in the house. And
good luck.
Yeah, it's not easy, and it's a matter of, okay, we're having dinner, put that thing down, shut the phone off, and set it aside because this is the time to be present. And
yeah.
So, Greg, you said something. I read the start of your book, and I love the start. It's fantastic. But you give the example of peanuts, right? And the example is 3% of the population has an allergy to peanuts, right?
Yep.
And it could be deadly for them.
Yep.
But by saying you can't have peanuts, the allergy or the power
allergy rate
goes up 17%. So by protecting the kids from peanuts, they actually become more allergic to peanuts.
Yeah, well, and that's both directly making our point that essentially our attempts to protect our kids are actually backfiring in a very specific way, but also making the larger point that a lot of these things that we're doing both on and off campus to try to protect students' feelings and protect them from negative interactions with each other are also in the long run really quite harmful.
Yeah, because I grew up if my men friends, my not boyfriends, but the guys I hang around with, if they weren't teasing you, making fun of you, they didn't like you.
Oh, of course, yeah.
You know what I mean? But now you can't say anything.
And what I see on campus, and at my work at Fire, I've seen buddies get in trouble for having on-PC jokes that were completely fine between the two of them, and they're even making fun of each other. But because a third party who wasn't heard it, they end up getting in trouble. And it's like, wow, this is, I also sometimes point out that some of this stuff even feels downright classist because, I started working in restaurants when I was 11. All my best friends are all, working class people. And the way you could tell who was the closest was whoever would hurl the most abuse at each other.
Yeah, I know. Your friends are always making fun of each other, and they can't do that anymore.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, I feel like they probably just have to hide it more, partially because if people overhear it, it's as if for some reason that third party is so horribly traumatized by hearing, male banter that it has to pretty much go underground.
But when somebody says, "Well, girls don't do that," man, some of them, I've known a lot of girls. They're just as vicious as guys are, and maybe more vicious. The knives are sharper, should I say?
And unfortunately, social media actually makes those kind of nasty behaviors that are synonymous with junior high kind of spiral out of control.
Right. So before we go on, I want to get to the point. Which came first? The chicken or the egg? Is it schools causing this, or are the kids causing this, or are the parents causing this? Because I'm going to bring up a word you talk about. You call it about trigger points, and now in school, a teacher cannot say anything that might upset the student. That's a trigger point. So before we go into which came first, the teacher, the parent, or the student? Why can't you say stuff?
It's always tough to figure out which came first, and a lot of times it's usually things kind of happen in their own trends and then they collide. And a lot of the book is trying to talk about different trends that are all colliding at the same time and all kind of come to the head in 2013. Because K through 12 was already teaching sort of a right not to be offended mentality to students, which is, of course, incompatible with First Amendment. But at the same time, social media didn't come into existence because of higher education or K through 12, and that sped everything up. We also have the fact that increasingly we live in communities that are more sheltered from people who don't share our points of view, and this comes right down to the city block, right down to the voting counties. We live in more politically homogeneous areas than we did 30 years ago by long measure, and we dislike each other more about it. So there are all sorts of pressures that are actually making it harder and harder to constructively disagree or to just speak your mind, or for that matter, ever be clumsy about speaking your mind.
But what's happening is more than that. It's more acrimonious. People are more, I wrote 2 books with Donald Trump. As we're wearing the scarlet letter, how can you, even our own families, I can't mention that I wrote 2 books with Donald Trump because they hate him so much. I said, geez, give me a break here. Why are we so acrimonious? Why are we so at each other's throats? Why are we so adversarial today? So when we come back, that's the really question I want to ask you is because it's at the point, if you're a freedom of speech, First Amendment attorney, and CEO of Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, FIRE, what are we to do? How do we protect ourselves from, trying to say nothing and be politically correct all the time? This is ridiculous.
You're listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
What is your number one expense in life? Your number one expense. It's taxes. And I've asked the question is, how come there's no financial education in school, but why isn't there education on taxes either? They tell you to save money, which is stupid. They tell you to invest in the stock market, which is stupid. But won't they teach you about taxes? So here we have Rich Dad advisor Tom Wheelwright. We're talking about his revision for his book, Tax-Free Wealth. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Robert.
So what's the tax-free wealth about? What's different this time? It's a revised edition.
Well, so what we did was this is the first major tax reform we've had in 30 years, 2017.
Was 86 was the last one?
86 was the last one, back when I was in Washington, D.C.
So many guys got wiped out because of that tax change.
They did. They did. It wiped out an entire industry, savings and loans. This new tax law is just as big, but in a very different way. It affects different industries. You know, the tax law is always a series of incentives. And the question is always which incentives and which ones apply to me. And so the key to revising tax-free wealth was what changed so much in this new tax law that we can absolutely take advantage of. Seriously, the amazing incentives. For example, the bonus depreciation, for example, for real estate is unbelievable. You buy a $1 million apartment, get a $300,000 deduction or more the very first year.
So if you want to make more money and pay less taxes like Donald Trump and myself, get Tom's book, Tax-Free Wealth.
Don't be like Charlie. Charlie is that do-it-yourselfer who does himself in. Do-it-yourself is good for tile and grout. It is not good for asset protection. Charlie thought he'd save a few dollars forming his LLC online. With no guidance, he did it wrong. When he sold the property, he lost thousands and thousands of dollars. He did himself in by trying to do it himself. Don't burn yourself. Use Corporate Direct to set up and maintain your LLCs and corporations. Corporate Direct is owned and operated by attorney and rich dad advisor Garrett Sutton. Garrett wrote the bestsellers Loopholes of Real Estate and Start Your Own Corporation. He is Robert Kiyosaki's attorney for asset protection. He and his team will do it right. Visit them at corporatedirect.com or call 800-600-1760. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off your formation fee. That's corporatedirect.com. corporatedirect.com.
Log on to richdadradio.com while you listen. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And you can listen to the Rich Dad Radio Show anytime on iTunes or Android, and all of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. And the reason we archive them is because we're an education company only. We don't sell products or services or investments or securities. So we recommend that if you're into learning, listen to this program. Again, especially if you have children. Especially if, you know, what Greg Lukianoff, excuse me, Greg butchered, it's like Kiyosaki. But anyway, you know, if suicide rate among boys is up and girls is up 70%, if I was a parent today,
yeah,
I would be looking for another way of solving this, because it's not just the kids. I have never, like Thanksgiving is no longer Thanksgiving. It's those who voted for Trump and those who didn't vote for Trump now. I mean, that's what it's coming down to. And
right.
The other side of the table, they all love Hillary, so I'm in trouble. You know what I mean? There's no freedom of speech anymore. There's just hate on Thanksgiving. So anyway, we're going to find out what's causing this and what advice you have for parents, especially if you have young boys and young girls and you're planning to send them to college to get in debt for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
So what would you say to parents? What's happening? Oh, by the way, his name of his book is Coddling of the American Mind. You should read it. How good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. Failure. So what would you say to parents, Greg?
Well, first thing we always say is we want to hear from parents too, because we have a whole section on solutions on what can be done, and things start as simple as trying to raise what are called free range kids, where they get more unstructured time, where they get actual playtime, that's kid directed. All of this sort of overstructuring that the helicopter parents do.
What's a helicopter parent? Because I flew helicopters.
Helicopter parent is basically someone who micromanages every aspect of their kids' lives. Usually, and these are mostly upper middle class, and the kind of people who are trying to get their kids into
Stanford,
Harvard, etc.
They're also called tiger moms in Asia.
But they're a little different, little different than tiger moms. But they call them lawnmower moms now too. That essentially they're just trying to blast through every obstacle for their kids. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that this approach is harmful. But we're getting to see that this is probably contributing to the anxiety and depression that we're seeing among students.
Well,
because
why would mom running, being a blocking, pulling guard for you? Why would that cause depression? I mean, my mom had big shoulders; she could take out any linebacker.
Well, because it implicitly gives your children the message that they can't handle this stuff on their own. If you schedule your kid from 6 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night, you intermediate every conflict that kid has, you're giving them a very strong message that, mommy and daddy need to do this for you because you actually can't do it. And there's a psychological concept called locus of control, and it's exactly what it sounds like. That essentially if you feel like you have no control over your own life and that basically you're just helplessly in the hands of other people, if you don't develop that sense, you tend to be anxious and depressed. And so, we're doing stuff that we had every reason to think would create a generation of anxious and depressed students, and then we're shocked that they're anxious and depressed.
So you call it, in your book, you call it vindictive protectiveness. What is that? What is
vindictive protectiveness is a little bit different. This is more an aspect that we see on campus and closer to what's known as call-out culture, where basically the goal, rather than arguing with people you disagree with in a constructive way, the goal is more or less to call out any violation of your interpretation of social justice on behalf, usually not of yourself, but of some mysterious, not often mysterious, but some other group that you claim to be protecting their interest. But it's really, that's where you get the campus shout downs, the disinvitations, the sort of the substanceless arguments where it's just about yelling about someone's privilege rather than addressing their arguments.
And you talk about let emotions do your thinking for you.
Yep, emotional reasoning. And we point out that emotional reasoning is, according to CBT, which I mentioned before, is a cognitive distortion. That basically, if you think every time you feel something, this is someone else's problem and someone needs to do something about it, that's a path to, again, a miserable life. And it's something that, usually in maturity you learn to, you learn how to sort of self-regulate. And but when you...
I've seen a lot of young people want to take up causes, well, what about the poor? What about the environment? And they just start yelling. They've never studied the causes of the problem.
Right. Well, and of course, they talk about some of these problems that I think are serious, problems as well. But nobody benefits from people who only know how to yell about it and not how to think hard on how to actually fix it.
Yeah, and relating to my kids, my wife and I are not helicopter parents, but we're certainly involved in what they do, and we will always be involved. I don't care if they're 20 or 25. So I think parents have to take responsibility on that in this new world of connectivity, where we hear from, the kids hear from their friends, or 24/7. We've got to be involved in their lives a bit more. And
it's interesting because part of what we're saying in the book is we have to allow more free, unstructured time. So there's in some cases we're telling people to let the reins go a little bit. But when it comes to things like social media, having not just a policy within your own family that limits your use of the internet and all that kind of stuff, because it turns out actually, the best we can tell from the research, about 2 hours a day of screen time, no negative consequences. But as you go further and further beyond that, that's when you really start seeing the higher rates of depression, the higher rates of anxiety, all this kind of stuff. But one of the real practical things you have to do is you have to find other like-minded parents, and particularly ones, preferably ones that are the parents of your kids' friends.
Right.
Because it's really hard to do any of this if basically every other kid in his social circle doesn't have these limitations. But since parents are starting to understand how much is at stake here, you can start having parents saying, listen, we're turning off our internet at 7 o'clock every night. We're going to be very strict about it, and we'd like you guys to help us as well.
Okay, so we have this world where today we have a future generation that's probably going to, I shouldn't say this, they're probably going to they're being set up for failure, and that's the theme of your book here. But is it the teachers, is it the parents, or is it the students? Which one came first, the chicken or the egg?
It's one of those things where a lot of times people think we're blaming the students themselves, and ultimately, what students think is the fault of parents. I'm a parent myself, but also K through 12, I think, is making some mistakes. And I think higher education is an institution that could really be helping with a lot of these, dysfunctional psychological habits and making people more open-minded about, where people are coming from and be able to take other people's perspectives seriously. But unfortunately, I think colleges too often do the exact opposite.
Right, and I grew up in a family of school teachers, and they're not the most open-minded people. You know, they live in a world of this is right and this is wrong. I may as well go to church. Hey, what is a microaggression?
A microaggression is a slight, often unintentional, sometimes intentional, slight that is usually either racist or sexist. Kind of like when you just insult somebody by saying something kind of like cloddish or like a faux pas.
Like I was saying, as far as guys go, conversation is just nothing but microaggressions.
Well, those might even be macroaggressions. Like essentially, like when I'm teasing my best friends, you know, like there's no question about what I'm doing. Microaggressions, it's kind of funny because microaggressions, I actually think, you know, it's good to study and figure out like how we insult each other without meaning to do it. But as soon as you turn this into a policy on a campus, first of all, you know, the First Amendment
regulation
come up. But they start looking like what University of California system has, which talks about microaggressions as including, and this is still in the books, things that include saying America is a land of opportunity, saying I think the most qualified person should get the job. All of these things are treated as if they're tiny forms of violence against minority groups because I guess yeah, exactly, it's insane. Partially because, you know, and the rationale is because apparently saying that anything is fair is somehow insulting to minorities.
I remember when I was in high school, my classmate came in with a new pair of loafers. And we said, "Hey, nice loafers. Speaking of loafers, how's your father?" He started crying, and we all got hauled into the office for that. You know, we thought it was funny. The principal didn't. You know, the kid didn't think it. You know, but so we can't even go that far anymore.
Oh no! Well, if you check out the work that we do at thefire.org, it's amazingly easy to get in trouble for what you say on a college campus.
Could you explain the thing? Because you started with peanuts. You had three main points to start, but one was the peanuts. And how does protecting, you know, what you call over-coddling, the coddling of a generation actually makes them weaker? And you use the example of peanut allergies.
Yeah, well, essentially, like if you're not exposed to peanuts, the likelihood of you actually developing, when you're relatively young, the likelihood of you developing an allergy to peanuts goes way up. It's kind of like vaccinating kids, and essentially you have to expose them to, you know, like we first discovered, we have to expose people to cowpox to prevent smallpox. And what we're saying all throughout the book is that by the kind of parents or administrators or K-12 teachers who always come in to try to settle conflicts between students for them so they don't actually have to figure out how to, you know, live with each other one-on-one, we're creating a situation in which we have a generation that is going to be looking to authority to step in whenever there are even relatively minor conflicts. And it's scary because if you, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, I'm perfectly willing to make this prediction. Human resources departments are going to be really overwhelmed in the next couple of years because if you have people coming in where every conflict they've ever had with someone else has been, you know, intermediated through somebody in power, they're going to be coming to human resources for things that are just normal, everyday give and take of working with people.
So one more thing that, you know, affects me because I love sports. How does this thing about, because it really bugs most of my friends because they give trophies to all the kids now. What is that any part of this thing?
You know, that comes up a lot. The unwillingness to say that someone's like either a winner or a loser in something. I've heard a lot about that. I mean, I played football. I got some awards for it, but we also got a medal way back in the 80s just for being part of the team. Nobody confused that though for actually being like someone saying you're the best. So I think that concern's been around for a while. I think it's more symbolic than real. But I do think that we do have some students who end up coming to college having never really been seriously criticized, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I went to military school when I was 18.
Were you criticized there ever?
Oh, God. Me, my mother, my father, my sisters, my brothers. I mean, the good thing is it makes me stronger.
Yeah.
And I remember I was showing my company my second place trophy And I said, this was the best thing that ever happened to me because it inspired me to take first place.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I didn't expect anybody to give me the first place. I said, okay, you guys, we came in second. Let's go for first.
Well, it's kind of funny because some of the opponents of who kind of want everything to be as nice and kind and soft as possible don't seem to get is that, like you were saying, when you say it makes you stronger, that being able to realize that you can handle adversity, you can handle insults, you can handle interaction with people on a daily basis, can actually make you a lot calmer and happier in the long run. Yeah. Meanwhile, if you don't think you're up to this stuff, that's how you end up with the counseling services at universities across the country being overwhelmed.
Yeah. So where are the teachers in this mess?
The teachers in K through 12, that was something we wanted to look a lot more into. We wanted to spend a lot more time on what high schools can do and how parents need to look at what high schools are teaching about everything from free speech to civics to just how you interact with each other and what the line where something is merely teasing and what's bullying, to make that distinction.
Well, let me tell you why. Is because I have two friends and I said, hey, you want to come on this program? They said, hell no.
Why?
Because their kids are always in trouble.
Oh,
and they said, we're tired of dealing with the administration because they punish our kids. They take if we stand up to the administration, the kids take the hit. The kids deserve, in my opinion, they deserved it. One guy set fire to the school, but who's counting, right?
You shouldn't set fire to the school. I'm willing to take a stand on that.
He just set off a smoke bomb. You know what I mean? And it was just a kid's prank. He was like 12 years old.
Yeah.
And the parents get in trouble. The parents get in trouble then.
That's the whole zero tolerance idea, that essentially like any sign of anything that could be of the slightest concern has to be punished. And it really promotes a kind of mindless overreaction to relatively small things, which has a name in psychology, and it's called catastrophizing. And if you're someone who's in the habit of watching all the adults around you catastrophize, you start thinking, hey, maybe I should overreact to everything too, and that sure isn't good for you.
And then my classmate, my roommate in Vietnam, he became a 3-star general, and he says, we can't find Marines anymore. It's getting harder and harder and harder.
That's concerning.
Yeah. He says, boy, they're kind of wimpy. So, Bob, any final questions? Because you're the one with the kids, not me.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I have taken the approach that we want our kids to be exposed to criticism and whatnot. Both of them have jobs dealing with the public.
That's great.
Yeah, and so
good training.
Yeah, so one of them works at a pizza place, and she comes home and talks, and sometimes she gets upset about how she was treated by customers. But I tell her that's the real world, and you're always going to find that in any job you have. My son, same thing. He works at a In-N-Out burger chain, and
delicious.
Yeah, same thing. Just really want to make them independent and see what the world is for real. I mean, my son doesn't watch much television. He doesn't play video games like the stereotypical kid now is, looked at upon as far as.
That's how guys like me see kids, that they're all on video games. Or I see parents sitting around the table and everybody's texting.
Right.
Yeah.
We kind of get away from that.
What does that do? It's an interesting time. So, Greg, I thank you for writing the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up Generations for Failure. Just came out this year. And also your website is thefire.org. And I thank you for doing your work and having the guts to speak out.
Yeah, and if your children ever get in trouble on a college campus, or you're a professor and you happen to, look us up, because we defend free speech on campus, and we usually win.
Right, and just to remind everybody, Greg is a First Amendment attorney. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's also president and CEO of Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, FIRE. So, Greg, thank you for your contribution to society. The question I ask myself is, maybe I'm wrong and they're right. Maybe we should just protect everybody and pretend the world is one big, happy, fluffy cloud.
I think that's actually a really good intellectual habit, to ask yourself, maybe I'm wrong and maybe they're right. You should do that. People should do that regularly. But it's really hard to convince me, though, that the solution will be that we take more and more offense on smaller and smaller things forever. Because at some point you have to be like, wow.
Keep up the good work. I'd like to have you back, because This is a discussion that I think we'll be having for a couple more years at least.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, Greg, thank you very much. When we come back, we're going to Ask Robert.
You're listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Don't be like Charlie. Charlie is that do-it-yourselfer who does himself in. Do-it-yourself is good for tile and grout. It is not good for asset protection. Charlie thought he'd save a few dollars forming his LLC online. With no guidance, he did it wrong. When he sold the property, he lost thousands and thousands of dollars. He did himself in by trying to do it himself. Don't burn yourself. Use Corporate Direct to set up and maintain your LLCs and corporations. Corporate Direct is owned and operated by attorney and rich dad advisor Garrett Sutton. Garrett wrote the bestsellers Loopholes of Real Estate and Start Your Own Corporation. He is Robert Kiyosaki's attorney for asset protection. He and his team will do it right. Visit them at corporatedirect.com or call 800-600-1760. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off your formation fee. That's corporatedirect.com. corporatedirect.com.
Financial freedom begins with financial education. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Radio Show.
Welcome back. Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And we're now going to the most popular part of our program. It's Ask Robert. And you can submit your question to AskRobert@richdadradio.com. So, Melissa, what's the first question?
Our first question comes from Lou in LaPorte, Texas. Favorite book, Midas Touch. It says, I grew up poor, but it made me work harder to leave my bad habits with money behind. I see my nieces and nephews developing poor mindsets around money now, and I can't stand it. My question is, how much do you think environment affects whether someone becomes rich or stays poor?
I think that's one of the more important questions that all parents need to ask because, just the other day, I apologize. I want to get him on this Rich Dad Radio Show because he's one of these social scientists. And he talked about rich dad, poor dad. And he says the reason rich kids are richer is because they grow up in a rich environment. And he says if you grow up in a poor environment, you have almost no chance of getting rich. And he says it goes on for 7 generations. So that's the challenge. So you have a child right now who's developing bad habits when it comes to money. Parents give them everything. They're going to pass it on to their kids and their kids and their kids, according to this guy. And Melissa, I'll get the name of this guy so we can get him on the program because he endorsed Rich Dad, Poor Dad. But it did affect me deeply to have a rich dad. And it also affected me deeply because I went to a rich school for rich kids. And had I stayed in a school for the poor kids, which was directly across the street from the rich kids' school, I kind of wonder where I'd be today. Because it was only until I got into the 4th grade at 9 years old did I realize I was stupid and poor. And every time the teacher said to me, I said, well, what am I going to learn about money? I said, I want to be rich. She says, well, just go to school. I said, well, my dad went to school. He's not rich. So that was kind of the crisscross in my brain at age 9. But according to this one social psychologist, is that it is passed on from generation to generation. There was this new study I was reading in The Economist this morning. And it says that if you're a poor kid born in San Francisco, you have twice the chance of becoming rich than a poor kid born in Detroit, because Detroit is so poor. So environment does have a lot of impact. What do you have to say, Bob? You have 2 kids. Kids are being taught differently, right?
Absolutely. After the influence of the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book and being around Robert, we've taken the approach that we talk to the kids about money, as your poor dad didn't do.
Right.
And they're well aware of what we do with the money and what things cost. And the fact that they both work, they understand the value of money, and they're not just getting money handed to them.
Do you talk to them about managing their money?
Yes, as far as
what they spend it on and all that?
Right, saving money and, at least having something to
something set aside.
Right, and not, spending every dime like a lot of young people do. Just developing those disciplines.
Yeah, the reason I created the cash flow board game is so parents could teach their kids. Otherwise the school is going to influence their brains. So that's a big thing. My poor dad always said, go to school and get a job. And as you know today, those people, if the predictions are correct and there's a 50% downturn in the stock market, many parents will lose their jobs. and then it's going to affect their kids. So the idea of job security today is really an obsolete idea. And then when as many more people don't become employees, they become Uber drivers and freelance independent contractors, then they're not going to have the benefits like retirement and health insurance and all that. So that's why we created the cash flow board game, so parents could teach their kids and parents could teach friends and people could teach people. But as we know, kids got to do a lot of homework and the kids are, they're overwhelmed. So anyway, that's why we created the Rich Dad Company. That's why we have the Rich Dad Radio Show. So anyway, I thank you for being observant of your nieces and nephews. Hopefully they'll turn and make changes in their lives. I want to thank Greg Lukianoff and Bob Turner for being part of this program. You can submit your questions to Ask Robert at richdadradio.com. And I thank you for all listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show.